all of a sudden, boing, you have made this complete transformation from point A to point B. Well, actually, you probably haven't. You may convince yourself you have, but then after that, the problems start showing up, and the misbehavior starts showing up, and the hypocrisy starts showing up, and take it a step at a time, deal with the problems as they come up, fail, because that's how you learn. You can't learn except by failing.
Welcome to the Embrace and Expand podcast, where we talk about everything from spirituality, self-development, relationships, mindfulness, wellness, and everything that will help you embrace all that you are so you can expand into the best version of yourself. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Embrace and Expand podcast. So earlier in this season, I invited world-renowned author and expert on Druidry, occult, and ancient mysticism, John Michael Greer, onto the podcast. That episode, Druidry, A Path to Wholeness, has since been the most listened to episode of the Embrace and Expand podcast yet. So since all of you listening seem to enjoy that episode so much, I thought it best to invite John Michael Greer back onto the podcast so we could gain some more of his wisdom. If you didn't catch that episode, go ahead and take a pause now and give it a listen. Then come back and join John Michael Greer and I for another enlightening conversation. John, welcome back to the Embrace and Expand podcast.
Thank you much. I'm glad to be here.
Well, so recently I discovered two of your books, The Ceremony of the Grail and The Secrets of the Temple. And they really instilled a lot of questions and food for thought in me in how many different ways the ancient teachings have really been lost in our modern society. And so I really wonder if you can share with us a little bit about what brought you to really bring these teachings back into our modern day.
Well, The Secret of the Temple was actually the first of the projects that I worked with. It was that was the seed from which Ceremony of the Grail and several other books still in process have unfolded. Basically, I've had a long time, of course, interest in esoteric traditions, suppressed knowledge, the whole range of things that our official versions of what's real refuse to talk about. And one of the things that I caught on to quite a few years ago, actually, was a number of cases in which legends about temples, legends about religious ceremonies, and so on, tended to include the rather surprising claim that doing these things benefited agricultural fertility. You build this temple, you do these rituals, and all of a sudden the crops are better. That struck me as kind of an odd claim, of course. But, and of course, it's usually simply dismissed as, well, they're just, primitive, and they can't think their way out of a wet paper bag, and all the usual kind of arrogance with which so many modern mainstream thinkers approach the past. But this was so consistent, and it showed up so often that I started looking into it and saying, okay, is there a way this can happen? Is there some way that religious structures in particular could produce effects on the ground around them that would improve plant growth? And in fact, there is. There are a range of them. And so that was what launched Secret of the Temple. I set out to explore the possibility that what we have, unnoticed in a lot of ancient and medieval religious structures, is a forgotten technology of agriculture, a way to improve crop growth, to improve crop yields, to produce better ecological conditions. I mean, I'm sure we can all think of very good reasons why something like this would be worth having. And that set me on the search of what I've ended up calling the temple technology. Now, this is one of those situations. It's like walking through a field where there are rabbits grazing. When one starts running, several others start running in other directions, and you end up going, "Oh, look, there's another." This was a similar kind of experience to me. Once the rabbit of the temple tradition started hopping away, so did several others, and that launched me into the question of the legends of the Holy Grail. Where did those legends come from? What did they originally mean? And in particular, there was a theory floated quite some time ago in the very early 20th century by a writer named Jessie Weston, one of the first women to really make it big in the study of folklore studies and the studies of the Arthurian legend. And she had argued that the Grail legends as we have them are kind of echoes of a forgotten religious ceremony. Obviously, that was of interest. So I proceeded to follow that rabbit hopping through the grass. So that was the genesis of the book, The Ceremony of the Grail.
So what I found very fascinating about you talking about the technology and using that terminology of technology in reference to these temples and buildings, and how many of these structures, and using the Mayan temple as an example, and one of the names translated into English was Corn Mountain, and how they would take the seeds to the top of these temples to enhance their viability.
There is now that was not my own discovery. There's a book. I'm temporarily forgetting the author's names, but it's in the bibliography, and it basically, a couple of physicists noticed that if you expose seeds to magnetic fields in a certain way, it does things to them that make them stronger, hardier, better growing. And so that was one of the major influences that I brought into this, and they were the ones who pointed out that what was the Seed of Plenty, Stone of Wisdom, I think was the title of the book. But they pointed out that, in fact, this was a technology. It's not our kind of technology. It doesn't involve the kinds of bells and whistles we like to use, but it was a well-developed technology that these people used for the very important task of keeping themselves fed. So it was in large part because they were pointing this out, the authors of this book. And because, just looking at the whole issue of technology, we have a very narrow notion of what a technology is, what a technology can be. Our science fiction these days is actually a good example of this, if you don't mind a little tangent here. We have an enormous amount of science fiction literature out there, and movies and books and all this kind of stuff, and it's gotten very boring because it's all the same. It's all just our kind of technology taken up a couple of notches. I think we need to embrace the possibility that there are other possibilities for technology. Technology can be different, can be radically different. It can be the kind of thing that can use a stone pyramid or a temple or a church to make crops grow. And I think if we start thinking in that broader sense, it will have very practical benefits for us right now, because we've taken our current technologies arguably about as far as they could go. Maybe it's time to look in other directions, but go on.
Yeah. And it makes me think of, some of the documentaries and literature I've read about the pyramids of Giza, and the fact that at one point in time they were encapsulated in quartz crystal, and many people had the belief that that was to enhance the area's natural ability to harness electricity with the rivers that would flow underneath the pyramids. Do you see that correlation also connecting with these other ancient cultures?
Well, there is certainly something going on with moving water and stone structures, whether it's electricity or whether it's some other energy pattern, some other kind of energy. I'm not sure yet. But in ancient Egypt and in India, I think this is still the case in India, in fact, if you're going to build a temple, you have to build it in a place where there's groundwater, and where there's groundwater that actually comes right up to the foundations. In Egypt, you have to dig a pit and actually get Nile water in the pit. And so there's this very definite sense that the combination of moving groundwater and stone is crucial to some kind of technological process. May not be limited to the temple technology as I've described. In the same way, standing stones in Northwest Europe, in Britain, in Ireland, in Northern France, and so on, dowsers, who of course make it their life's work to learn how to track underground flows of water. Dowsers routinely find very unusual water flows around standing stones. And so again, what was going on here? We don't know yet. There's a lot of room for further research and investigation here, but clearly somebody was using that. Was it a way of generating static electric charges? That's one real possibility.
It's really interesting. And I've started to notice a new trend on social media I follow a lot of people who do sustainable gardening and permaculture techniques, and of people using large poles with copper wire wrapped around these poles within their garden beds, garden boxes, And one gentleman was explaining at how this enhances the electrical charge that's within the ground and the root structure of the plants, thus yielding a 3 to 4 times growth within all of the plants that are in the general area. So is this kind of a similar way of technology as what they were using temples for?
That's one hypothesis. One of the things about my book, The Secret of the Temple, is that it's more an attempt to start an investigation than it is to provide conclusive answers. We don't yet know, largely because nobody's done the test. I mean, we would have to build a temple in an appropriate place, in the appropriate way, do the traditional ceremonies in it, and see what happens. Try getting funding from that, from scientific funding sources. That'll happen about the time that they fund a serious objective test of the effect of astrology. But now the thing is, the use of electricity as a way, whether natural or artificial electricity, as a way to enhance plant growth, that's a known thing. Up until the Second World War, there was an entire system called electroculture, where people would use big batteries to run a trickle of current through the soil, and they got excellent results. That went out the door after the Second World War because the chemical industry was huge, and they managed to squeeze that out in favor of chemical fertilizers. But there has been experiment. I've been watching the copper wrap poles and so on. Very interesting. Quite some years ago now. Dr. Thomas Galen Hieronymus, the inventor of the Hieronymus machine, did a lot of work also with earth pipes, as he called them, and they were typically pipes made of choose your material. These days I've seen them mostly done with the big plastic pipes that are used for like house sewer drains, but they have wire in them, they have coils in them, and so on. I built one. I used to live in Western Maryland. I put one in my backyard. I had corn plants 13 feet tall.
Wow.
I am not making this up. There's a picture, there's a photo that I have. It's circulating online. It is. I was astounded. There I am standing next to these plants that are twice as tall as I am, and they're ordinary corn. It was one of the weirder experiences in my life. So this stuff works. This stuff works dramatically well, and in fact, Hieronymus's earth pipes, that's a fairly widely used, alternative technology as well these days, along with some of his other inventions. So there's a whole world of possibilities out there. It is really promising to see people getting into that now and really starting to look into what is the effect of, bringing atmospheric electricity into the earth, which is what these pipes do. What is the effect of using paramagnetic and diamagnetic substances on how do those affect seeds? What are the effects of all these things? This is basic science. This is real science, not just I have to do this experiment and get the results that fit the current narrative so that I can get a paper into a prestigious journal. This is okay. How does nature function? What happens when we try this? That's real science. And there's a lot of people in the alternative scene who are doing it these days.
Yeah, it's going through that trial and error process by actually doing it instead of looking into, okay, well, what can a computer tell me that if I enter all of these calculations in, what is the yielding result and whether it's going to be positive, whether it's going to be negative. Instead, let's actually try this. Let's put it into fundamental practice and see if it works.
I was horrified a few years ago when a friend of mine who's in the university biz, as I suppose you have to call it these days, mentioned that in most science classes these days, they don't actually do experiments. They do computer simulations of experiments. Why? Because the experiments don't always come out the way they're supposed to. And just think about that for a moment. Think about the fact they're literally teaching people experiments that don't work and making them work by doing them in computer simulation to prop up a failed model of science. That's a devastating indictment of our universities, of our modern approach to knowledge. I mean, we could get very deep into that, into the whole the replication crisis and so on. But modern science is falling to bits because it's abandoned the simple task of looking at what actually happens.
That's so fascinating. And it really makes me think back to, you were mentioning in a portion of The Secrets of the Temple, talking about
Mm-hmm.
at how there are different types of sacred geometry that was used in
Mm-hmm.
creating these structures. And I know many of the
Mm-hmm.
listeners will probably think, oh, sacred geometry, they must be talking about like the Flower of Life and Metatron's cube and all of these various different things. But we're talking geometry in the actual like mathematical sense of
Mm-hmm.
measuring things to know exact perfect proportions without having to do any math per se
Mm-hmm.
on where something needs to go. And what I also found fascinating is that you started talking about the resonance of those
Mm-hmm.
buildings and how their shapes and the proportions of those buildings would create a harmonic resonance via like sound
Mm-hmm.
waves in there. And that made
Mm-hmm.
me think back to some research I was doing into cymatics, the science of
Mm-hmm.
sound and the visual
Excellent. Yes.
representation of
Okay, good.
sound,
Good. You're looking
and
into cymatics. That's excellent.
how some of the stained glass windows in many of the cathedrals throughout Europe are
Mm-hmm.
actual representations of the cymatic harmony
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
resonance of that building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it was fascinating that your research went side by side with the research that I've done into sound, and how,
Mm-hmm.
okay, if these buildings can have an effect on the plants that are grown, what type of effect do they
Mm-hmm.
actually have on our bodies and the
Uh-huh.
water molecules that are in
Uh-huh.
our bodies that
Uh-huh.
coincide into
Uh-huh.
resonance with just the harmonics of being in that building.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, now you've actually raised two really important points here that I want to address. First of all, sacred geometry. Yeah, seriously, we're not talking about something that's done with mathematics in the current sense. You don't have to crunch numbers. It's done in the traditional sense with a straight edge, a compass of the circle drawing variety, and a pen or pencil. Those are your tools, and so every proportion unfolds from the natural properties of order in space. And there are different geometries. Each of them has its own effect. In medieval Europe, we know that there was a real significant division between two different geometries, the ad quadratum geometry, which worked mostly with the square and its diagonal, and so tended to produce square or octagonal structures, and the ad triangulum series, which was working mostly with what's called the Vesica Piscis. Those of our listeners who are familiar with the Flower of Life, the Vesica Piscis is what that is based on. Druidry Melchizedek's work mostly works with the square root of 3 with the ad triangulum system. That's great, but it's only one of the two systems. So these two systems were used in different parts of Europe because they got different effects. And in other parts of the world, you find different sacred geometries in use. And so there's a lot of work needed to be done to understand the geometries of some of the old sacred temples and some of the other structures that were used in this, and to take that and say, okay, this is a guide to what seemed to work in that area at that time. Let's see if it works now. Let's give it a try. Let's actually build something. Okay, so that's the sacred geometry. That's something I've done a few other projects on. I am planning on a large book on the subject, but that's down the road a little bit. Okay, sound. This is going to be one of the central themes of my own future research, partly because of a really interesting experience I had in, what was it, 2003. Yeah, when I was in England, my wife and I were traveling in England doing research at the archives of a Druid order that I belong to. And one of the things we did in the midst of this, we went out with a bunch of other Druids to the Wilmington Longman. Now, if you know your English antiquities, you know the Longman. He's this big chalk figure carved on the side of a hill. He's holding a tall staff in each hand. Okay. Now, what we discovered by accident is that if somebody is standing at the head of the Wilmington Longman and somebody else is standing at this low hill down below the foot, they can have they're like 2 football fields apart, okay? They can have a conversation in normal vocal tone.
Wow.
The hill has been shaped to direct sound from one place to the other, and people standing in between can't hear it at all. It was one of the most amazing things I've ever experienced. there's my wife down at this hill 2 football fields away, and here I am standing on the head of the Wilmington Longman, and we're just chatting. And so there was recently a news story. In fact, they discovered, somebody did some research into this and found that Stonehenge is designed so that the inside of it is a kind of circle of silence. If you're inside it, you can hear anything that anybody says inside it. If you're outside it, you're shut out. You can't hear what's being said.
Interesting.
So obviously, people in megalithic Britain had enormous knowledge and practical mastery of sound waves. They were doing things with their stone circles, with their earth figures, with literally shaping the land to direct sound waves here and there. So that, and there's the whole issue with cymatics, and with the fact that you have these stained glass windows, these rose windows that show cymatic patterns. Now, cymatics are simple. You can actually generate them, as you well know. You can get these patterns by sprinkling a fine powder onto a piece of glass and playing the edge of a glass with a violin bow.
Mm-hmm.
This is technology that people had thousands of years ago. It's not difficult to do. All you need is a flat surface and some way to get high-pitched vibrations. Hans Jenny, who invented the science of cymatics, was, he did amazing things with it, but he was very much following in the footsteps of the ancients here. So clearly, again, people in the Middle Ages, when these cathedrals were being built, they had an extremely sophisticated knowledge of acoustics, and they were doing things with them. What were they doing? We don't know, because all of these things were the secrets of guilds and the secrets of monastic orders. Most of the orders have lost what secrets they have, and as for the guilds, well, Freemasonry is what it is. It has a lot of virtues. It does a lot of good in the world, but in terms of mystic, esoteric secrets preserved for the Middle Ages, it has very little. Mm. So, it's all a matter of rediscovery.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to that almost like trial and error of how can we begin to look at these ancient structures and try and recreate new structures and see if we can't find those harmonic resonances again.
Yeah. We can certainly start by taking structures that work, structures that are known known by experience to produce very uplifting experiences in the people who are in them. Structures that have a long legendary reputation as centers of fertility, centers of energy. The Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem is a great example. It's very well documented, and the Bible itself gives all the proportions and the details of the design. So, but of course there are others, and there are actually documents from, again, India is a good place, where they actually give the instructions for laying the thing out properly. How do you choose the place? How do you set up the geometry? How do you orient it correctly? How do you do the thing? And so we're not left to start with absolute trial and error. We have some clues, we have some guidance, but the question is finding people who are willing to pick that up and run with it and actually do something with it. And of course, finding people who have the time and the resources. Building a temple is not cheap.
Right.
If a temple were cheap, I would have built one long ago. But I have not yet had that opportunity. We'll see what happens. Never say never. I hope I do have the chance. But at the moment, my research is mostly focused on books and other written sources, because that's what I've got the funding for.
One of the big questions that arose for me when reading about these structures and using those sacred geometries, and you referenced the placement and being cognizant of east to west, north to south, the direction in which the buildings were built. And it made me think of all of these cookie cutter homes that get built, that people are investing large sums of money to have these architects design these extravagant homes. And yet I don't feel that any of these technologies are being taken into account in how does the home actually make me feel when I'm inside of it?
Most of them feel dead.
Exactly.
And one of the great problems here, back in the day, and we're talking here up until the Renaissance, the standard rule was if you wanted to design buildings, you started by learning how to build them. if you wanted to become an well, of course, the architect wasn't a separate profession. That is, if you wanted to become a master builder, you went to work as an apprentice, which means you were doing things like hauling buckets of mortar around the job site. And you gradually worked your way up, developing skills, building things, working on job sites, getting your hands dirty, and bit by bit worked your way up to the point where, if you were good enough, you would become a master builder, and then it would be your job to lay out the diagrams. Okay, so and so, Lord such and such wants a new castle, the bishop of such and such needs a new church. Your job, guy. Our architects nowadays are hopelessly insulated from the realities of actual building.
Right.
They don't have to learn how it's done. They sit in their offices and draw daydreams on paper, or brain farts, as the case may be. And so you get situations like Frank Lloyd Wright, whose work I generally admire, who routinely made designs that would only work if there were materials and supplies that literally didn't exist. He wanted beams of such and such length. There are no trees that large. And so many of his, in fact, probably most of his buildings have been torn down at this point because they're falling apart, because they can't be built to his specifications, because he didn't have that on-site experience to actually say, okay, this would work. And of course, architects also don't generally live in their own structures, which is why they can get away with building these horribly ugly, inhuman, dead places, and then go waltzing on getting awards for how innovative they are.
Right. Just because it looks pretty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. New does not necessarily mean improved. I mean, that's one of the great lessons we're all learning these days. I think it was Calvin Trillin who mentioned the word upgrade has become the most frightening word in the English language. Because that when your computer's upgraded, it's going to get worse. There will be problems. It may end up turning into a brick.
Right.
Because, if it's new, it's not improved. Anyone who's dealt with Windows 10 or 11 knows this painfully well. Windows has been declining in value since Windows 7, and arguably even before that. And so, and this is true. This is true. Also, we're fixated with this fantasy of progress, this fantasy of improvement, as though whatever's new must be better. And in fact, very often, whatever's new is worse. This is why it's time to stop and look at the past and ask yourself, okay, what did they have that we've lost? What did they know that we've forgotten? What could they do that we don't have a clue how to do? And the secret of the temple, of course, was all about that.
And I also, I kind of want to really go back to, most of these ancient structures were built with natural materials that were locally sourced for the most part. Whereas many of the homes that are built today, you have materials that are coming from all over the world. Some are natural, most are synthetic. And so we're living in buildings that keep us disconnected from nature instead of keep us connected to nature.
And that's very much a matter of the materials. It's also a matter of the design. If you look, and this is true of houses, but it's much more true of the workplaces. Look at the number of the buildings, whether they're office buildings or what have you. They have no connection to the place they're in. They raise fortified walls against everything around them. They're trying to say, we don't belong to nature. Of course, government buildings are all, we don't have to listen to you, peons. That's what their architecture says. But it's all a matter of trying to construct this bogus existence, which is set apart from nature, which is made of unnatural materials, and then people are miserable and sick living in them, and everyone goes, "Oh, why? I don't know why that should happen."
Yeah.
It's really sad. And you look at the architecture of other societies, architecture of traditional cultures, and so often those blend with the setting. They connect to the environment, and so whether both in the materials, in the design, in the placement and orientation, and so you get much better results. Again, what did they know that we've forgotten? Well, that's one thing. Yeah,
And one thing that I noticed was interesting to, kind of take us a little bit away from the structures, but to go back to the ceremony of the Grail
Mm-hmm.
was you were talking about how, and you can see this throughout history of how many of the organized religions eradicated these nature-based religions and these nature-based spiritualities.
Mm-hmm.
And slowly after
Mm-hmm.
that, you had disease, famine, ecological and economical issues,
Mm-hmm.
all because the people were no longer worshiping the nature that they were coming from. Instead, they were worshiping some,
Mm-hmm.
higher form thought process of this is how we should think instead of remembering everything that came before.
Well, you're talking to a druid, so you get no argument there. The thing is, this kind of thing has happened before. One of the things that I point out in the ceremony of the Grail is that the stories of the wasteland, the stories of the devastated land that followed the loss of the Grail, probably date back to legends from the fall of megalithic Britain, of megalithic Europe. The dreadful subsistence crisis that happened when they abandoned one set of religious practices and structures that focused around the long barrows and moved into another set that focused on stone circles and some of these other things. But you're right that this has especially been true since the rise of, since the coming of what astrologers call the Piscean age, the period where the sun at the spring equinox is in the sign of Pisces. That's when you get all these prophetic religions. You get obviously Christianity, but also Buddhism and Islam, and a bunch of others that are a little less popular, but still very widespread. And they're all based on the idea that this one person knew the truth.
Mhm.
And you can tell that you're dealing with a prophetic religion because the prophetic religion is all about this is the truth, and you have to believe it. The older nature-centered religions didn't do that. They weren't about belief. They weren't about, you have to accept this set of opinions. It was very often you need to do this set of practices, or you need to, participate in these ceremonies or what have you. But it wasn't about having the right opinion. Once you get stuck in the opinion model of religion, as we could call it, you lose the ability to learn.
Right.
And because, you know the truth, at least you think you do. And so there's this real tendency, especially over the last 2,000 years, since the coming of the Piscean age, that people get stuck in their ideas. They get stuck in these opinions. This isn't just my opinion. This is truth revealed by the infinite. And if you don't agree with this stuff, I have to go. I'm going to beat you up until you do.
Yeah.
That's been the attitude. And what a miserable approach to life that is. One of the reasons that we're dealing with this profound amnesia, this almost this senility of blinding us to the past, is precisely this tendency to clutch ideas, this tendency to think that a given set of opinions is the absolute truth and it's the thing that matters. The thing is, you see this in secular ideologies as well. Marxism is a great example. Again, it's a set of absolute dogmatic ideas that have to be rammed down everyone's throat. They don't work, but try getting a Marxist to recognize that.
Yeah. And this really brought up the question for me of do you see a correlation to the disconnection from nature or the worship of nature, like in the nature-based religions, with many of the issues that we face globally today?
Oh yeah. Now, it's important to keep in mind that there are the issues we actually face globally, and there's the media furies being whipped up, making claims about some of those issues.
Right.
Climate change is a great example. Is the climate changing? Yes, absolutely. Here, I live in Rhode Island, okay? It was in New England. We just passed through a, quote, New England winter with negligible snowfall. It just rained a lot. That never happens here. And yet, now it does. We're going through, the weather is changing. Many parts of the world, the weather is changing. Exactly what's causing it is a much more complex matter than I think most people are willing to grasp, because one of the basic rules about nature is that nothing has just one cause.
Right.
Everything is caused by various factors piling in together. And so there are things that are affecting the climate right now that are entirely natural. And there's the fact that we're dumping billions of tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which is not helping matters. But Does that mean that we're all going to die in 5 years? Well, that was what Greta Thunberg said 5 years ago. Last I checked, we're here. And, no, the thing is, climate change is a commonplace event in the history of the planet. It happens all the time. 6,000 years ago, the Sahara, what's now the Sahara Desert, was grassland. Lions and gazelles and elephants lived there. There were big lakes across what's now desert. The climate changed. The way it's going, the climate may be changing back to that. In which case, if you happen to live in Algeria or Chad or what have you, you may have a very good time out of climate change. During the ice ages, Death Valley was a mountain lake surrounded by pine forests. It used to rain all over the American deserts in those days. So the thing is, climate change happens all the time. Climate change is a permanent phenomenon. There are certain elements in today's society that are trying to whip up a panic about climate change to get certain political goals through. And so anytime you're going to look at what's happening in the world, you have to set aside the various political groups that are yelling about it on one side or the other, try to figure out what's actually happening, and say, okay, what do we need to do to either deal with this, respond to it, or maybe influence it? Now, all that is kind of prologue to my answering your question, which is, if you are stuck in a prophetic belief that history has to follow this rigid line, whether the rigid line is going to end with the second coming of Jesus, or whether the rigid line is going to end up with Marxist proletarian revolution, or what have you, you cannot adjust to the fact that the world changes. You cannot adjust to the fact that nature is nature is a moving target. And nature is bigger and stronger than you are, so maybe you're the moving target. If you have this orientation toward nature, if you have a spiritual recognition of nature as ultimately perfused with the divine, as something that spiritual and divine powers move through nature at every moment, then you can listen to what nature is trying to tell you. You can say, okay, the climate is getting warmer here in Rhode Island. Maybe we should start, planting peaches. Maybe if you're in Chad or Algeria, be aware that you may start getting monsoon rains. How's that for a change of path? Or what have you. Instead of just frantically insisting that everything must stay the same, except when human beings change, and if human beings change, that's good or that's bad or what have you, yell. Attend to nature, listen to nature, learn to perceive what nature is doing and what changes she has in mind, and then your life is easier and more successful.
Recognizing that change is inevitable. It's something we're all going to go through at some point in time or another. It's not something that we need to fight. It's something that we just need to accept as part of the process of the human experience. Yeah,
it's gonna happen. It's like all these people who are frantically trying to stay 21 for the entire duration of their lives. You can't. You have two choices. You can get old or you can die. Take your pick. Personally, I think getting old is a better idea. Yeah. And that doesn't mean you have to get senile and feeble and weak. You can age in a healthy, robust, hale, strong fashion and still be robust and active at the age of 80 or 90. People do this all the time, but they do it by recognizing that age happens. You're gonna get old, so learn to do it gracefully. In the same way, the climate is always changing. At every moment, the climate is shifting this way or it's shifting that way. Through most of the middle years of the 20th century, it was actually cooling. That's why, back in the 70s, people were freaking out about the possibility of global cooling and a new ice age. That's going to be a little further off, but we will get there. And now it's global warming. Well, yeah, it cycles through various patterns, and there are these things happening, and probably the world's going to be warmer. It's been warmer before. Our species has been around through a bunch of different cycles up and down, and if we can adjust, or we can be stupid and try to keep things exactly the way they are, like the 70-year-old women pretending to be 21 and making a complete embarrassment of themselves.
And it's interesting that we're kind of getting on the topic of aging in our bodies, because as I was reading about the wasteland that kept coming up, I couldn't help but to feel that was almost a metaphor for our own body, and that we must cleanse our own body, mind, and soul in order to cultivate a fertile environment in which it becomes healthy and will thrive.
And that is best done not by following some rigid set of prescriptions handed down by another prophet. Here again, we get that prophetic thing. But by learning to attend to our bodies, learning to perceive what our bodies are asking for, and learning to perceive what our minds are asking for, not necessarily what they crave because they're sick, but what do they need? What actually feels good and healthy and whole? What do we need for our spirits? That's a matter of perception, not of lecturing and dictation.
Yeah, really listening to what your specific body asks for and recognizing that we can't all follow the same diet. We can't all follow the same rigid structure of you have to work out this one way or you have to live this certain way, but really recognizing that each of us have a very unique body. We have a very unique mind. We have a very unique soul. We have a very unique nervous system. And we have to learn how to read our own manual instead of expecting somebody else to be able to tell us how we're supposed to drive this vehicle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know people who thrive on a vegan diet. I know other people who get desperately sick if they go on a vegan diet. Some people can digest plant proteins well, some can't. I know people who thrive really well to go to the opposite extreme on the kind of the Paleolithic diet where they're eating nothing but meats and and a few vegetables and grinding nuts in their teeth and practically cracking bones with their teeth, like Neanderthals. And they thrive. And there are other people who the ketosis is not good for them. So it really is a matter of finding out what works for you, not of accepting some kind of blanket thing. And by the way, anytime somebody tells you this is the one true path, they're just trying to exert power over you. They're trying to control you. Ignore them.
Yeah.
Better still, laugh.
Run as fast as you can.
Yeah. or point and laugh if you think you don't mind putting up with the tantrum. But yeah, we are all it's like that scene in Monty Python The Life of Brian, where Brian, who's he shouts out the window, "You are all individuals," and this whole crowd shouts back in exact chorus, "Yes, we are all individuals." We get a lot of that these days.
Yeah. It's like that herd mentality of, everyone has to follow the same way, the same structure. And yes, that is true in nature. You watch flocks of birds, they're all going to eat exactly the same thing. They're all going to fly in the same direction. They're all going to follow the same patterns.
Actually, watch the birds closely. The flock moves in one direction. The birds are constantly adjusting their position within the flock.
Right.
They're not moving in uniform fashion. The flock moves together, but even if you see geese flying overhead in the V, they've got one strong goose who's out in front, who's kind of breaking the way for the others, setting up patterns of airflow that make it easy for the others. After a while, that goose will drop out and another goose will take the place. And even so, they're all adjusting their way because they're all in different conditions. There are different bits of turbulence. They have different strengths. They have different talents, just like us. And so even when they work together, they're working together in a kind of fluid way, a way in which they're engaging constant personal adjustments. They're not being rigid and mechanical the way so many human beings think they have to be.
Yeah. They flow with one another and recognize that the pattern is going to change.
Yeah. We can do the same thing. Human beings do in many contexts. It's just in the modern industrial world, we have this obsession with the mechanical, the obsession with making things do this one thing that we tell them to do, like the gears in a machine going clunk, 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 a step at a time. It's the particular obsession, the particular genius, and the particular curse of our culture that we've developed that as far as it can go. But we've developed it further than it works, and so we have all of these frantic attempts, especially by people with power and influence, to try to make the rest of the world behave in these rigid fashions, and it doesn't work. It just doesn't work.
Well, now it that kind of brings up a lot of what you talked about in the ceremony of the Grail with certain rituals and rites of passages that many of these ancient cultures went through. And I started to notice almost a trend that seemed to go throughout many of those cultures where they spent time in darkness and silence. They fasted. They had the consumption of a sacred brew or sacrament before they were actually permitted to commune with the realms of spirit or the gods or deities that they worshipped at that time. And to me, that sounds very familiar with many of the plant medicine ceremonies that much of the indigenous cultures of South America partake in, that is becoming very popular within the spiritual communities of today. So it's almost like there's this resurgence of ritual coming back into helping us to really get in touch with who we truly are and how we find ourselves within the world. So do you see that there is this tie between the lack of ritual in modern day societies versus bring that ritual back to help us become more of a connected whole consciousness of a community of people?
Oh, the thing is, this happens historically from time to time. Every civilization at some point in its history passes through an age of reason. The age of reason that we hit at the beginning of the 18th century is nothing new. The Greeks had it in their time. The Hindus had it in theirs. The Chinese, and so on. Every civilization goes through this, and rationalism comes in, and everyone goes, "We don't need those silly rituals. That's just empty forms and hand waving, and we're going to make things work in a rational fashion." And then, of course, that falls over on its nose, because human beings are not rational creatures. Human beings we inherently think in symbols, and rituals are simply symbols that are enacted. Symbolism in action, symbolism in motion. And so typically right around the time, the phase that we're in now, the point where the age of reason is breaking down, people are realizing that too much rationality is frankly toxic, and that it's time to feel our way through things a bit more and try to think our way through them a little bit less. The ritual comes flowing back in. And so, we're doing that right now. Again, you mentioned from other parts of the Americas where traditional indigenous plant ceremonies are coming into use. There's many other similar traditions, and we still have a few survivals of those within the almost the mainstream of the Western world. Freemasonry is a great example. They may not have a lot of ancient technology to offer, but they still remember how to put on a good ritual. And I can tell you, there you are sitting, waiting for the ritual to begin. You're in this little room. You are oddly dressed. You have been divested of all kinds of things. You are apart from the world you know. It's a spooky experience. And then there's the sound of the door. Somebody the door into the lodge. Somebody knocks, and the door opens, and you're blindfolded, and away you go into a completely unknown environment. Psychologically, it's very powerful. And these are ritual forms that are used in Freemasonry. They're used in a lot of other Western esoteric spiritualities. I've been sitting outside that door, waiting for the guy to show up and put a blindfold on me and take me into the lodge room quite a number of times now as I've been initiated into different traditions. And it never fails. I mean, it's a little more familiar now than it was at my first initiation, but it still has an effect. So, that's one version. The plant ceremonies that you mentioned, that's another version. There are many others. These things are coming into use again in our society because we need them, because they're, the experience of ritual initiation is an essential part of our humanity. It's as essential as telling stories. It's as essential as having love affairs. It's as essential as cooking meals. It's a normal part of being human, and we have so many of us been starved of it for so long that people are getting back into it in a big way. You've been eating nothing. If you've been eating nothing but fast food for most of your life, and somebody actually sits you down with some real food, it's going to be a little unfamiliar at first. But once you feel how your body's responding, you're going to stuff your face.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are stuffing their face with ritual right now, and I think that's healthy. I think that's an appropriate part of the healing and the resolution of the conflicts raised by the Age of Reason.
Yeah. And I think part of what I've noticed, at least in several of the ceremonies that I've partaken in, and many of the rituals that I utilize
Mm-hmm.
on a regular basis in my own
Mm-hmm.
personal practice,
Mm-hmm.
is that it really cultivates a greater sense of community, especially when
Mm-hmm.
it's done together. Like my wife and I, we have
Oh yeah.
ceremonies that we do on the new and
Mm-hmm.
full moon every month,
Sweet.
and
Mm-hmm.
we have
Mm-hmm.
ceremonies that we do at certain times of year, and not just for
Mm-hmm.
those quote unquote special occasions, but even to just recognize that, maybe we're feeling a little bit off. So, hey, let's sit down with a cup of cacao and have a conversation. And it doesn't even have
Yeah.
to
Mm-hmm.
look any certain way, but can create a deeper connection between the two of us. And
Mm-hmm.
we,
Mm-hmm.
we have the
Mm-hmm.
Embrace and Expand community that's, part of the podcast and part of our business. And we gather
Mm-hmm.
together every Wednesday. And it at
Sweet.
first
Mm-hmm.
started off as, okay, we're going to do certain daily practices like breath work or qigong and meditation. And
Mm-hmm.
many of the
Good.
nights now, it just is, we have beautiful conversation and talk about how our weeks went. And sometimes practices come up, sometimes
Mm-hmm.
things that we need to talk through come up, and then other times it's just a space where we can join together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And of course, in our society, perhaps more than most others, the destruction of community has been a major negative consequence of the Age of Reason. We've had such a focus of replacing human contact with mechanical media, mechanical intrusions into human spaces, and our architecture is so isolating. And so this movement back toward community, facilitated by spiritual processes, but not limited to that, is, I think, extremely important.
John, this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation, and I really love the way in which you are continually diving into many of these ancient cultures to bring these wisdom teachings back into the modern day with a spin on how we can use many of these ancient technologies to really bring us into the dawn of a new age.
It's got to happen, and that means that people, people need to do it. And I didn't notice anyone else volunteering in these particular things. Lots of people are doing very good work in various other things, but in the case of some of these traditions, I was interested and nobody else seemed to be looking at them. In the case of some of the other things I've written about, I just happened to have a chance to be initiated into something or to get access to some materials or study with a teacher, what have you. And then I end up being basically the last man standing because I studied with a lot of teachers who are a lot older than I was at the time. And so it becomes a matter of, okay, somebody's got to do it. Besides, it's interesting.
Yeah.
It beats the bejesus out of sitting on the couch, watching a TV with drool puddling on your lap.
Well, I can definitely attest, having read several of your books now, that the way in which you present this information is incredibly intriguing, incredibly enlightening, but also very thought-provoking. And I really enjoy how you present the information that does exactly that, makes us think of how can we begin to shift our lives and apply some of this new information to really bring us back into a full sense of wholeness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The German poet Rainier Maria Rilke wrote an amazing poem in which he described coming into contact. He was going to an art museum and he saw this Greek statue of the god Apollo. And it was just stunningly beautiful, and he was just standing there looking at it. And he realized that, in effect, it was saying to him, Du musst dein Leben ändern. You must change your life.
Mm.
And I think a lot of us are having that experience now. A lot of us are feeling, Du musst dein Leben ändern. You must make your life different. And so that has certainly happened to me, not just once, but repeatedly on my spiritual journey. I know it's happening to a lot of other people, and it's a good sign because things that grow and change are living. things that are static and unchanging are dead. We have a lot of death in the world right now. We need more life.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I literally have full body truth bumps of you saying that. And I love how you touched on that you've changed multiple times throughout your life. And that it is not this static thing of, I'm going to become this new person and then I'm just going to be that person forever. But to recognize that as we gain new information, as we gain more knowledge through our own life experiences and the trials and errors and screwing up and doing things wrong and getting back up and trying again, that we will continue to change and change and change. And I think that's an important aspect for many people to recognize, that it's okay to change.
Oh yeah,
we aren't meant to stay the same.
Yeah. This is one of the many reasons why I find the old Grail legends so moving, because they're all about a quest. It's not you go someplace, you get the Grail, you sit down, and that's the end of it. No, it's a long road before you reach the Grail castle. And even when you do, you may have another long road to travel afterwards. Yeah. It's a continuous quest, a continuous pilgrimage. You're always meeting new things. You're always growing and changing. Wolfram von Eschenbach, who wrote one of the classic Grail legends, Parsifal, describes it as the story of a brave man made slowly wise. And I think a lot of us are in that situation. We're very slowly learning to be wise. And that's the human condition.
And change should be slow, because anything that changes too fast typically tends to be more destructive. So ease into that change.
Yeah, one of the things that is worth distrusting about some of the prophetic religions is the focus they have on sudden conversion. All of a sudden, boing, you have made this complete transformation from point A to point B. Well, actually, you probably haven't. You may convince yourself you have, but then after that, the problems start showing up, and the misbehavior starts showing up, and the hypocrisy starts showing up, and no. Take it a step at a time. Deal with the problems as they come up. Fail, because that's how you learn. You can't learn except by failing. And so you just keep on going.
Wonderful. Fantastic advice. And so for our listeners that really enjoyed the conversation that we had today and the various aspects of what we talked about, what would you say would be the ideal point in which they start through your reading materials?
Oh, that is not an easy question. I would say if they're interested in the spiritual dimension, I would direct them to my book, The Druidry Handbook. That's one of my most popular books. It's an introduction to the concept of Druid nature spirituality, but it also covers a lot of other stuff that will help lead into that whole subject. If you're interested listeners who are interested in the specific things we've been talking about, probably just go straight into The Secret of the Temple. It is fairly well suited to the beginner. It doesn't assume that you've read anything else beforehand, and it covers the ground pretty well. And then the other thing that I would encourage readers to consider, if you need, again, a fairly easy way into it, I've written a fair amount of fiction these days. And it's not just, here's a story. All of my fiction is perfused with esoteric and spiritual themes. The most recent publication is the first in a series. The title is The Witch of Criswell, and it's going to end up being the story of one person's magical initiation, but we're doing it a step at a time. It's an occult mystery series, and it should be fun.
John, thank you again so much for your time and joining me on the Embrace and Expand podcast again. It is such a pleasure talking with you and really getting to dive deeper into what you bring into the book, even though like I said, every book that I've read is just such a wealth of knowledge and information that it's so wonderful to have somebody like you on this planet to bring these teachings back to us.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate our conversations. It's always fun to sit around and talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you all again for joining us on the Embrace and Expand podcast. Greatly appreciate you being here and listening to another episode. If you enjoyed what we had to talk about today, feel free to share it with your friends and family on all of your platforms. It really helps to get the message out there and share more of this knowledge and wisdom with the rest of the world. So thanks again for being here, and I'll catch you on the next one.